Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Mandatory COVID-19 Vaccines in Post-Secondary Education. And I'd like to thank especially our higher ed clients listening today who have gone through this journey with us over the last couple of weeks and months. Before we begin, there are a couple of housekeeping items to cover. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource widget. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is CLE accredited in California and Illinois for 1 hour of general CLE credit, and in Missouri and New York for 1.2 hours of general CLE credit. 1 hour of general CLE credit in Texas is pending. We award CLE based on attendance for the entire 60 minutes. Due to changes in jurisdictional requirements, you will notice that we are no longer using automated pop-up attendance checks. As required, we will display secret words in 2 multiple-choice polls during the webinar. You will be required to select today's secret word from a multiple-choice list. Please respond to these 2 polls to demonstrate your continued engagement and to earn your full CLE credit. We value your opinions and appreciate your participation in the course. Thompson Coburn is a full-service law firm with over 380 attorneys. We have offices in Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles, New York, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. We have a prolific higher education practice which provides legal counsel, compliance, and training services to college and universities. Our higher education practice is made up of practice areas throughout the firm. We have individuals in all of our offices who focus on higher education and are here to answer any of your questions or needs should they arise. We also have multiple webinars on a variety of higher education related topics presented throughout the year. You can go back and watch recordings of most of our webinars. Be on the lookout for information on our 2021-2022 webinar series. Today's presenters are Katie Wendel and myself, Susan Lorenc. I practice in our Labor and Employment Department and offer a holistic approach to client needs, whether it's on the counseling side all the way through to litigation, and I frequently counsel and handle issues that arise in the higher education space. My colleague, Katie Wendel, practices in the higher education group and will be offering a lot of fabulous content throughout today's presentation. Today's syllabus is in front of you at this point. You'll see that we are going to provide an overview of how post-secondary institutions are addressing vaccines. We will then move to student policy considerations. I will then touch upon the landscape of employee policy considerations. We will address best practices for implementing a mandatory vaccine policy and address also various responses that we're hearing throughout the constituencies. We will turn it over to Q&A, although I would encourage anyone who has a question to ask it throughout the course of this presentation, and we will do our best to answer it as they come in. However, we may wait till the end, so don't be discouraged if you don't receive an answer right away. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Katie, who will start us off with the overview of how post-secondary institutions are addressing vaccines.
Thank you so much, Susan. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here with you today. This is obviously a very hot topic. As a higher education attorney, I am probably more tuned into this, but I feel like I can't open a news feed without a mention of a mandatory COVID-19 vaccine policy and the associated controversy with that. So it is certainly true, of course, for institutions of higher education. As we see here, hundreds and hundreds of colleges and universities across the United States have put COVID-19 vaccine mandates in place at this point. One of the first we all heard about was Rutgers, who made their plans for a mandate public at the end of March. Since then, schools have wrestled with the idea and landed in many various places. We have been working with clients who have put them in place and reviewed dozens of policies from all types of institutions. We have seen schools with a full mandate requiring all students, regardless of their program or even whether they are attending in person, all the way through to schools that do not mention the vaccine in their publications whatsoever, their publications related to attendance or moving forward into the next semester. I have spoken with folks at schools where they believe part of their mission, and sometimes, of course, it is literally in their mission, is to promote the safety and health of their community. I've also spoken with campus leaders who feel that getting a vaccine of this nature is a very personal choice and that they can put other policies in place to maintain safety and the kind of school that they aim to create for their students. One thing that does seem to vary from policy to policy as I've read through these and reviewed these and helped shape some of them is the timing of both the rollout to the campus community and then, of course, when the vaccines have to be obtained under the policy. Rollout was quick for some schools where buy-in was widespread, and then again at many other schools it has taken longer to get full approval from the required parties. So if you've got a lot of different constituencies with a lot of big feelings, might take longer. And then also some have to deal with balancing state and local politics, which we will discuss coming up. Another factor that varies is what kind of evidence or proof a school is going to require to demonstrate vaccination. Some schools want students to upload their vaccination card to the institution's system. Others are relying on the honor system and just asking students to simply confirm or attest that they have received the vaccine. Finally, schools are also having to think through the consequences for students or staff who do not comply with the policy. Many schools are allowing unvaccinated students and staff to remain 100% virtual, but a lot of schools don't want to maintain that option across all programs and courses, and it really complicates things for schools that are continuing to offer some programs online or pre-pandemic offered these programs online, and then who gets that option and who doesn't becomes a really complicated question. Of course, we will also hear from Susan later on the employment side, and there are many staff members who cannot do their job remotely. So, if that's your policy, where does that leave them? Many schools also, of course, have testing policies, masking policies, and social distance policies in place, and all of those vary widely, sometimes based on region, sometimes based on school, sometimes based on school leadership. And then finally, many policies have dismissal as the ultimate, termination of their attendance if they ultimately decide not to comply with their vaccine policy. So that is something that some schools have not only contemplated, but also decided to follow through with. So very interesting, interesting discussion, needless to say. It has been, I keep using the word interesting, but perhaps my definition of interesting is a bit wonky. As I said, higher ed is very exciting to me. But the messaging coming from institutions is, from my perspective, an important part of the rollout that we've seen. There's always a balance between being clear and concise, the tone used, and then also providing the details necessary to convey the important message. I've got a couple of quotes here from the University of Michigan's Office of the President, who just recently put their policy out. And you'll see at the second line there, at least 600 U.S. colleges and universities have announced similar vaccination requirements with the same motivation: keep their communities as safe as possible while they ramp up in-person teaching, extracurricular student activities, and research during the remainder of the pandemic. So, this is the main theme that I continue to see for most of these high-level communications that have gone out for these mandates. We want to get you back on campus. We don't want to interrupt the semester with testing and quarantining. we want to keep you safe. And of course, in the background, we know the underlying messages under all those too are another important goals of the school. We don't want to be a hotspot for COVID-19. College-age kids are among the lowest levels of vaccination, and close personal interaction is often a bedrock of, the college experience. So those have been the themes that I continue to see as I've seen communications roll out from different institutions. Later in this presentation, we will discuss responses to these mandates from other government and regulatory agencies, but I did want to highlight here some of the many, many policy and political views and statements that have helped to shape this decision for schools. So you've got the U.S. Department of Education and the White House sponsoring a college vaccine challenge. As I mentioned, college-age citizens are far below the average for vaccination of adults across the country. I don't know if any of you saw, the White House even had Olivia Rodrigo visit with President Biden and Vice President Harris to promote vaccines for 18 to 24-year-olds. I'm probably outside of their audience, but I found that pretty intriguing. Oh, I'm definitely outside of their 18 to 24-year-old audience. Meanwhile, many states have passed or pending legislation that touches on these vaccine mandates. And I will talk more about those again shortly, but suffice it to say that the highly politicized nature of COVID-19 vaccines, just about everything right now is really highly politicized, and that really added to the conversation schools are having about what they can and should require for their students and staff. We also see here that the CDC is encouraging institutions of higher education to promote vaccines. They have detailed instructions for hosting vaccine sites on campus and provide resources for schools to help them educate their populations on the vaccines. Schools are not obligated by the CDC's recommendations in any way, I do want to note, but they are meant to provide guidance for schools from experts in the field, of course. And that leads us into a discussion of policy considerations on the student side. First, I wanted to talk about legal issues schools need to contemplate as they decide what to do and what kind of policy, if any, to put in place. State laws are going to form the majority of any legal restrictions or lines that schools need to consider as they're drafting their policies. Many states have pre-existing laws related to vaccination requirements in schools. Sometimes that just includes primary and secondary education. Sometimes that includes post-secondary education. Sometimes the laws are under the state's Department of Health. Sometimes they are under the state's Department of Education. And I want to say all that to encourage you all to be sure and take a hard look at the state laws where you are located. Of course, for schools with online programs, that might mean contemplating the laws of all 50 states. So many schools, of course, though, have already considered vaccination laws in their state. Most, if not all, schools already have some sort of vaccination requirements in place pre-pandemic. In fact, some of those requirements are dictated by the state laws that I'm talking about. So these rules, I will encourage you, though, to revisit those rules because they may contain hang-ups for your COVID-19 vaccination policy. I have, the Louisiana example on here. In Louisiana, there's a law that schools must allow students or the parents of a minor student to dissent to vaccines in writing. That dissent is all they need, at least as the law is currently written, to be exempt from the school's vaccine policies. I'm going to talk about exemptions momentarily, but this notion of a dissent isn't something I have seen in many policies, so certainly something to consider as you are figuring out what to do on campus. Then there's also this notion of state legislation, and there is so much pending legislation regarding COVID-19 vaccines, and I don't think we are anywhere near the end of it as more and more schools are getting ready, gearing up to head back to school in the fall, and even local school boards are having major battles over whether or not vaccines should be mandated, or, for local lower elementary and primary schools, secondary schools, of course, sometimes students aren't able to get vaccines yet, so then there's also the issue of masks. So all of this is currently being contemplated on all levels of government and politics, and they are, so they are writing legislation, they are determining legislation, and so that just requires kind of a continuous tracking of the current state of things. And then once you figure out if there is any legislation to think about, you need to decide, do an analysis of whether or not the legislation applies to your school or your student population, your employees. And then, of course, there are a lot of states that are legislating around the idea of what evidence a school or a business or a public entity can require. So, I've seen a lot of laws regarding this notion of vaccine passports, and those are not okay in some states. So a school just needs to be careful about whether or not they will require proof from students in those states or how they want to require evidence of a vaccine. And just as an example, we've got some states that have passed legislation that I know has affected some of my clients, Florida, Texas, Indiana, Oklahoma. They all have some variation of a rule or a law that specifically calls out post-secondary education or specifically calls out private businesses that does affect schools as they consider what to do. So there's a notion of exemptions, and across the board, I have seen policies include an exemption for disability or medical reasons as well as religious accommodations. Both, just a quick legal overview here of those exemptions and kind of the legal basis for them. So both public and private colleges and universities must provide equal access to post-secondary education for students with disabilities. Title II of the American Disabilities Act covers publicly funded universities, community colleges, and vocational schools. Title III of the ADA covers privately funded schools. So all public or private schools that receive federal funding are required under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act to make their programs accessible to students with disabilities. So schools are allowing students to request an exemption from their vaccine policy or an accommodation for the policy under these laws. Then you've also got religious accommodations, the civil rights laws enforced by the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, OCR. They protect all students from discrimination, but none of the laws that OCR enforces expressly address religious discrimination. However, under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that they offer protections for students of any religion from discrimination based on a student's actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, or citizenship or residency in a country with a dominant religion or distinct religious identity. So based on those legal requirements, we have encouraged schools, of course, to include those exemptions in their policy, and then just as a matter of practicality, to include those funnel those exemption requests through their typical chains of response at the institution. So for many, that means they direct those requests to the Office of Disability Services or their Office of Equity. And another thing I want to quickly mention, just in case I don't remember to bring it up later here, is that when you are including those exemptions in your policy, I encourage you to revisit the process for a student to apply for those exemptions. Just another chance to make sure that they are all within the limits of the law and that you have a good policy that you feel good about for students to request those exemptions. Of course, there are also privacy concerns. As I mentioned, some schools are requiring students to upload their vaccination record. We have to consider the privacy of those records, and schools need to figure out how they fit in under their current privacy laws. I don't think there's anything beyond current privacy laws that a school already follows that need to really be contemplated, but just something to think about as you consider how long you're going to hold on to those records or where those records are going to be stored, who would have access to those records, et cetera. So on the practical issues side, again, I've talked a lot about implementation, but, you know, it's just going to come down to getting everybody on board. I have campus buy-in on this slide as well. It's just a big undertaking to make sure you have buy-in all across all channels of your institution. And you have to think through who is going to do what and who's going to be responsible for what. You know, you can draft the policy, but then you also have to make sure that everybody who will have a role in implementing that policy is up for that challenge and will have the time and capacity to take care of that. You need to consider the applicable populations. So are you just going to require students in on-campus housing to follow this policy? Are you going to require any individual who steps onto your campus? Are you going to require everybody who's a member of your institutional community? Those are all obviously important things to think about as you contemplate policy of this nature. Of course, you also need to think about the implications of noncompliance, which I did talk about at the top. Maybe students will go 100% online if they choose not to comply, or maybe they can find another institution that does not require vaccines for them to attend. And we'll talk later about the Indiana University lawsuit, but that is an important notion in the judge's decision on that lawsuit, that the option is there. You're not requiring somebody to get a vaccine, you're requiring them to get a vaccine to be a student at your school. You also need to contemplate the timing and rollout. You know, if you're requiring everybody to be vaccinated by August 28th, probably need to have the policy in place before August 1st. You know, students need, no, way before August 1st, actually, if you think about it. It needs to be many, many months or many, many weeks earlier. You have to get 2 doses of some of the vaccines and then wait 2 weeks after the second one. So depending on your policy and how you define the vaccine and how you define fully vaccinated, you just need to think about when you need to roll the policy out and then when you can set the deadline for vaccination based on that rollout. I have already discussed campus buy-in and the importance of that, and I'm sure you all are well aware of how important that is for any policy that you set at your school. So, we have reached today's first secret word, and the secret word is green. So please select the secret word, the correct secret word, from the drop-down selections below. I have been instructed to wait a little bit to make sure everybody has a chance to do so before I move on. So I will let us be quiet, but I will say that my oldest daughter's favorite color is green, so she'll be very excited. I did not select this secret word, but the program was on our side today. Okay, I think that should have given everybody a chance to respond with the secret word green. And I'm going to turn it over to Susan, who will talk with us about employee policy considerations.
Thank you, Katie. So there has been a lot of discussion and misinformation around whether or not an employer can mandate vaccines. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today applies to any type of employer, any type of private employer specifically. Certainly it applies within the higher education space as well, and there are some elements of the conversation that are unique to the higher ed space, but by and large, the landscape does not change drastically between industries. We had the benefit back in May of 2021 to receive some guidance from the EEOC that really clarified what the rights of an employer are, which is lovely in that that doesn't always happen and does not necessarily occur with any regularity that enables us to move on with some guardrails. But in this case, the EEOC has provided us that guidance. I should note that it is just guidance. It is not law. It is relatively untested, although, as Katie's already hinted at, and as we'll discuss in a bit, there are already plaintiffs who are filing lawsuits on these types of issues. But the new guidance from the EEOC confirms that an employer may require all of its employees who are physically entering the workspace to be vaccinated for COVID-19. However, employers must still comply with their reasonable accommodation obligations under the ADA and Title VII for employees seeking an exemption from a mandatory vaccination program. The EEOC also advised employers to be mindful of whether certain groups of its employees may face greater barriers to receiving vaccinations than others, and to make sure their program does not disparately affect any protected groups. So what does that mean? Let's break that down. First, the reasonable accommodation exemptions for disabilities. The ADA requires any employee who has a disability to undertake a reasonable accommodation conversation with their employer. It is incumbent upon the employee to prompt that conversation, although the employer certainly can't sit back and wait and say, she has not uttered the words reasonable accommodation, so therefore we have no duty. No, once we're on notice that an employee has a disability as defined by the ADA that might impact their ability to perform the essential functions of their role, the employer then has the obligation to undertake an interactive conversation to see if there is some reasonable accommodation that would allow their employee to continue to do their job. If there is an undue burden, as defined by the law, that prevents the employer from providing an accommodation, that is another conversation to have to explain to the employee as to why we cannot accommodate their needs. The same is true in the vaccination landscape. If an employee who is being directed to receive a vaccination per a mandatory vaccination policy comes to the employer and says, I have a disability that prevents me from getting the vaccine, it is incumbent upon the employer to engage in that conversation to see whether or not we can accommodate an exemption in that case. Meaning, can the employee continue to work from home? Is this a job that the individual can do from home? If so, a court might very well view that as a reasonable accommodation, especially if that employee has been working from home for the last 18 months. Anyone who's attended any of my webinars in pre-COVID situation will know that this concept of work from home was quite volatile, shall I say. A lot of employers were very reluctant to provide a work from home arrangement for fear that that would open the floodgates. Well, if there's one thing that the last 18 months has shown, it's that working from home is now going to be viewed by many courts for many roles as a given. And so if someone has been able to work from home and has done it well, or at least up to our reasonable expectations, making them come back to the office and making them get vaccinated is going to be a much harder sell. If this is not a role where the employee can work from home, then we need to be looking at whether or not it's reasonable to allow the person to not be vaccinated and still come to work, and whether or not there are other accommodations we can provide, whether that's mask mandates, whether it's enabling the person to be socially distanced from other workers. If this is someone who is teaching a course that requires individuals to be close in a clinic, all around a cadaver, or in some sort of hospital setting. Maybe socially distanced individuals is not feasible. If they are in a hospital setting and the hospital is requiring vaccines of anyone coming in, it probably is not reasonable to allow that person to forego vaccines. The bottom line is, in any conversation around an exemption, these are very factually intense discussions. These are case-by-case analyses. We're not able to have a straightforward approach. We really need to look at these as they come into us. We should be utilizing specific people or even one person whether that's in a human resources capacity or in legal, that undertakes the analysis of the request in order to determine whether it's truly an undue burden on the school or whether it is something we can accommodate. The same is true and yet different for the next type of accommodation, which is the sincerely held religious belief accommodation. The EEOC's guidance specifically explains that the definition of religion is very broad and protects beliefs, practices, and observances with which the employer may be unfamiliar. Therefore, the employer should ordinarily assume that an employee's request for a religious accommodation is based on a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance. However, if an employee requested a reasonable accommodation and an employer is aware of facts that provide an objective basis for questioning either the religious nature or the sincerity of a particular belief, practice, or observance, the employer would be justified in requesting additional supporting information. I think it's very important that the takeaway is that the individual's purported religious belief is going to be deemed to be sincere unless we can truly establish that we have a reasonable basis to question that sincerity. In other words, the default is that it's legitimate. The same is not necessarily true in the disability context. We're able to really explore the reasonableness of the requested accommodation in a disability setting, whereas in a religious accommodation scenario, the presumption is that we will need to accommodate the request for an exemption unless we can really fit within a very narrow group of questions around the sincerity. I think it's equally important that we have a specific point person or persons to address these, and that we're not leaving the request for an accommodation under a religious exemption up to individual supervisors who may not appreciate just how high of a hurdle it is to overcome someone's claimed sincerely held religious belief. There's also the question of access, and it's raised, as I already said, specifically by the EEOC. This was certainly the case back in May when this came out, certainly the case prior to May when this was all being discussed and decided by the EEOC. I think it's hopefully less of a request now, or less of an issue now, and will continue to hopefully be less and less of an issue. But definitely at the beginning of the rollout of the vaccines, we were seeing that there were certain parts within the United States where we weren't able to have the same access to the vaccine that we had in other, maybe more urban settings. So if you have an employee in a specific area of the United States that comes to you and says, I simply cannot abide by or provide a sufficient response to your mandated vaccines by the date in which you've mandated because it's very hard to find in the U.S. I think that is a conversation we need to have with the individual employee and really look at whether or not that's legitimate and address that, again, on a case-by-case basis. I think this is going to be less of an issue going forward, but especially because the EEOC calls that out, we're going to have to be mindful of that. As far as the undue hardship goes with respect to both of the disability and religious exemptions, we need to really be sure that we can articulate what that undue hardship is before we play that card. It is not going to be sufficient to simply say it will cost us too much money to allow this employee to work from home. Money in and of itself is not determinative in the eyes of the law. We're going to have to really be able to explain why is it too much money? What is it that we're being asked to provide? Is it too much money just because we don't feel like spending that kind of money, or is it a legitimate expenditure on our P&L? You know, what is it that's creating this cost? I really encourage everyone to be able to articulate in advance what that undue hardship is before we play that card, because if we get to the point of having to defend this practice in court, a court is certainly going to be critical of our quote-unquote undue hardship. We are seeing some response from state legislatures. Not a lot, though. I will say these are few and far between as of August 5th, 2021, and we probably should have said right at the onset, all of this that we are presenting today is predicated on what's happening today. These are evolving areas within the law. They are evolving on a day-by-day basis, and we are certainly on top of what's going on and can provide updates as requested. But as of today, the state legislatures in Texas, Florida, and Montana have all chimed in on this issue of mandated vaccines for their employers. In Texas, their governor issued an executive order on June 29th prohibiting state agencies and local governments from requiring face masks. Now, obviously, this is a bit different than the question of the mandatory vaccines, but we will see the overlap in a moment, specifically around the reasonable accommodation issue. The executive order goes on to say that public schools may operate as provided by and under the minimum standard health protocols found in guidance issued by the Texas Education Agency. It specifies, however, that private schools and individual institutions of higher education are, quote, encouraged to establish similar standards. So in other words, while encouraged from refraining from requiring masks, it does not appear that the Texas executive order applies to higher education. So what does that mean from our perspective? If you are an institution of higher education in Texas and you are mandating that your employees, and Katie will touch upon this from the student perspective, but from the employment perspective, if you are going to mandate that your employers be vaccinated in Texas and still provide those exemptions that are required under federal law, you are allowed to require masks of your employees who are unable to obtain a vaccine. So that could be a reasonable accommodation still within the state of Texas. In other words, in Texas, while there's a lot of noise around what the governor has signed into law via an executive order, it really has very little implication on private employers, including those in the higher ed space. In Florida, Governor DeSantis signed an executive order in April prohibiting so-called vaccination passports. Those are anything that would require an employee or customer or student to provide proof of their vaccination status. However, and of primary importance here, the executive order specifically stated that the requirements in this order do not otherwise restrict businesses from instituting COVID-19 screening protocols in accordance with state and federal law to protect public health. Governor DeSantis also recently signed an executive order preventing district school boards from establishing mask mandates and allowing the Board of Education to withhold the transfer of state funds to any school district that violates the executive order. Now, the executive order in Florida does not seem to apply to higher ed and post-secondary institutions, but rather just K through 12. However, to the extent an higher ed institution receives state funds, it is possible that the prohibition against mask mandates could apply. That said, there is currently nothing in place in Florida that would prevent any type of employer from mandating vaccines. So, very similar to Texas, while there is a lot of noise surrounding these executive orders in Florida, we're sort of left with the same conclusion. If you are going to make vaccinations mandatory to your employers, again, Katie may touch upon the student side, but with employers, there's really nothing to prevent you from doing that. You are not, however, allowed to ask for proof of that of your employees, and we'll kind of talk about that in greater detail in a moment. Anyways, but in Florida, you would be prevented from asking for proof. You would, however, be allowed to mandate masks for anyone who requests that accommodation and is going to be in person. Montana, however, has by far the most prohibitive law regarding mandatory vaccinations for employers and their employees. There, the legislature passed a bill that recognizes an individual's vaccination status as a protected characteristic. That means an employer cannot refuse to employ, i.e., cannot fire someone based on their vaccination status or proof thereof. The law also makes it illegal to require employees to disclose their immunization status and bars employers from requiring employees to receive, quote, certain vaccines or to show proof of such vaccination. Now, the prohibition around those certain vaccines is limited to those vaccines whose use is allowed under emergency use authorization or any vaccine undergoing safety trials. In other words, the current status of the COVID-19 vaccine. So the takeaway for anyone who has employees in Montana is that we really are prevented from doing much in the way of mandated vaccines. There is now this protection around one's vaccination status the same way there is around someone's race, gender, ethnicity, age, religion, sort of everything that you've heard from a Title VII perspective. Now, vaccination status is one of those. So you cannot refuse to hire someone because they're not vaccinated. You cannot terminate someone because they are not vaccinated. I think this is also, though, a good time to talk about this concept of emergency use authorization, because I think this is an area where we hear a lot of conversation, at least, around why we should not be able to make vaccinations mandatory for our employees because the COVID-19 vaccine is only, quote unquote, only subject to emergency use authorization. While we're not going to spend a lot of time on what that really means under the law, I did want to highlight that the U.S. Department of Justice has recently stated through a leaked memo from the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel that the COVID-19 vaccine's status as an emergency product has no relevance, frankly, and in other words, does not prohibit employers or universities from mandating vaccinations. And interestingly, it specifically called out universities. So to the extent anyone is pondering what import that plays, whether it's full FDA approval versus the EUA status from the U.S. Department of Justice's perspective, which, much like the EEOC guidance, is not law, it's just guidance, but from the DOJ's perspective, it has no legal import. A couple of other items that the May 28th EEOC guidance touch upon was incentives. So if you're not going to make vaccines mandatory of your employees, can you strongly incentivize them to get them? And the short answer is yes, that is permissible under the EEOC's recently disseminated guidance. The guidance clarified that employers who are administering vaccines directly to their employees, so not through a third party, but directly to their employees, may offer vaccine incentives as long as the incentives are not coercive. Because an entity administering vaccines must ask certain disability-related screening questions, there is a concern that very large incentives could make employees feel pressured to disclose protected medical information. However, employers who provide incentives to employees for showing proof of vaccination by a third party, but who do not administer the vaccines themselves, may provide larger incentives because they are not receiving any disability-related information from their employees. Employers offering incentives may require employees to provide proof of vaccination by a third party, either by providing documentation or self-certifying that they have been vaccinated. However, all employers must be careful to keep vaccination information confidential, including by ensuring vaccination information is kept separate from employees' general personnel files. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but I'm sure a question that you're all having is, okay, great, what do very large incentives and even larger incentives mean? And, you know, God forbid the EEOC provide specific examples. Suffice it to say, we will be kind of testing that out as these cases come out, but I think it's safe to say that, you know, certain financial incentives, whether it's a monetary bonus, whether it's extra PTO days, whether it's the providing of, you know, iPads or some other giveaway, are all going to be analyzed through the lens of the proportionality to the employee. So if there's an employee making 6 figures, maybe a $500 bonus is not going to be viewed as so large that it feels coercive. A $500 bonus to an employee making $30,000, however, may start to get into the realm of coercive rather than incentivizing. Much like our analysis of the accommodations, this is going to be on a case-by-case basis and should be looked at through the lens of what makes sense for the individual employee group. The privacy issue I want to touch upon quickly, being cognizant of the time, in terms of what's permissible for proof. So I want to make sure that we're aware that we need to treat this as the same as we would a medical record, i.e. not keeping it in their personnel file but keeping it separately. The EEOC did say that for a third party, this is who's providing the vaccine, this is not the same as a disability-related inquiry or information. But that said, we still do need to treat it as confidential. So practical issues that I think we need to consider: are we going to make these mandatory? Are we going to say either get vaxxed or stay home or mask up? What type of proof are we going to require? As we've already discussed, in both Florida and Montana, we cannot require proof. And overarching to all of these considerations are the implications of noncompliance. We must apply these policies consistently, lest we create even more headache for ourselves. So before a school decides to make a mandatory vaccination policy, we need to be willing to have the conversation of firing employees who refuse to undertake the mandatory vaccination and who do not otherwise have these types of exemptions. It is now time for our second poll, and today's second secret word is bird, as in the thing that flies in the air. Please select the correct secret word from the drop-down selection below, and as Katie did, I will now give about 15 seconds to give you an opportunity to answer the secret word of bird.
Susan, I've got to chime in. When you started to say the secret word bird, as in, I thought for sure you were going to say big, but, you know, we clearly weren't quite on the same.
My kids are a little bit older than yours, so I'm out on Sesame Street days.
All
right, I'm going to turn it over.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So in the time remaining, I'm going to turn it over to Katie to discuss best practices.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, so, you know, I did touch on a lot of the issues that I wanted to discuss for best practices as I was talking through the policy considerations, but I wanted to get a little deeper into some of those ideas. The first one here I have is staffing. You know, who is coordinating this effort for you overall? Who will everyone turn to when things get crazy? I also want to think through, or encourage you to think through, who is communicating all the communications. When students are emailing with problems, who is responding to them? When employees email with problems or questions, who is responding to them? And I would definitely encourage you to coordinate those responses. As Susan mentioned a minute ago, consistent application is so important on all fronts, certainly from a legal perspective, but also from a practical perspective and a PR perspective. You want to be able to say that you are applying your policy consistently for everyone and no one's getting special treatment or a different answer when they write in with questions or problems or concerns. So those are obviously big things to think about. And I did already mention, contemplating who is accepting those exemption requests and who's tracking the information once you receive someone's vaccine record. I also wanted you to think through the notion of events. If you have a vaccine mandate for your campus or for your certain programs or for certain schools, do you also need to draft a policy for events that take place on that campus or with that student population? And if so, are you going to require something different than what's in your policy for students, graduates, employees? Are you going to require something different for guests? Just something to think through as you're, thinking through how your school wants to address COVID-19 vaccines. Of course, we have discussed repercussions of the policy and how you will follow through with those. That leads back up to the notion of staffing and who's doing what, who's following through when students don't follow the policy, and who's prohibiting them from entering campus or from joining a class. You also need to contemplate this notion of mandating vaccines versus encouraging or incentivizing them. And Susan did just talk about this a moment ago for employees, but tons and tons of schools or school districts or state school systems are establishing these incredible incentivization programs to encourage students to get vaccinated. This is a minor example, but I couldn't resist when I found this image of the Krispy Kreme donut free donut if you get vaccinated. You might not be able to see on your screen, but the vaccine card under the donut, the name of the person is Jane Doe, D-O-U-G-H. So couldn't resist including that in this slide. But yeah, schools are offering scholarships, they're offering discounts on tuition, iPads, huge rewards for students to demonstrate that they are vaccinated. So that is, of course, another option, or either in tandem with your mandatory vaccine policy or instead of. And then there's also this notion of timing, which I did talk about earlier, so I don't think I really need to get into again. Some policy considerations. We are thinking through the definition of a vaccine. What does it mean to be fully vaccinated? I encourage you also to have a detailed FAQ ready to roll out simultaneously with your policy. As always, the hope would be to address student and employee concerns upfront and maybe minimize that communication coming in to your staff. And then you also need to consider the idea of future modifications. I, of course, encourage you to include that in your policy because, as Susan mentioned, this is an ever-evolving area of the law, area of policy, and you might need to change that policy next week based on a new law that's passed in your state. So certainly something to include in your policy there too. And then this notion of who this applies to. I have talked several times about the notion that schools need to figure out who their policy will apply to, but I also wanted to discuss another important consideration as you're drafting a policy or even making adjustments to a policy that you already have in place. Many resources have touched on the idea of vaccine confidence and underlying vaccine reluctance, but I wanted to make sure it was on your radar as well. So the CDC has this statement in their guidance for institutions of higher education. Certain communities and groups have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 illness and severe outcomes, and some communities might have had previous experiences that affects their trust and confidence in the healthcare system. Vaccine confidence may be different among students, faculty, and staff. Institution of higher education administrators should tailor communications and involve trusted community messengers, including those on social media, to promote vaccinations among those who may be hesitant to receive COVID-19 vaccination. So I want to make sure that was just something that you're thinking through as you think about a policy. And on a similar note, I wanted to mention something that some of our clients have done, which is to incorporate an access exemption in their policy. And that is just an exemption in addition to the exemptions I discussed earlier, and it would be for someone who states that they cannot get the vaccine based on where they live or something like that. So international students, do you have international students attending your institution? Are there vaccines from outside the U.S. that you will accept that would meet your policy's requirements? If you do have international students, I would encourage you to think about having even a separate FAQ for international students. That FAQ could address what they should do if they can't get the vaccine before they arrive to the United States. Will they need to quarantine when they get to campus? Can they get the vaccine the day they get there and then, follow up, et cetera? They might need to consider delaying attendance and your policy also just needs to contemplate this notion of vaccines that haven't been approved by the FDA or the World Health Organization if you do have international students.
And Katie, I would just chime in real quickly and say, to the extent you have operations in other countries, we need to be mindful of the various rules around mandating vaccines in those countries as well, especially because the access to vaccines is not necessarily as prevalent in various countries. So it cannot be what works in the U.S. works elsewhere as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Susan. And then the final thing on this slide is just this notion of tying in with your existing vaccination policies. And as I mentioned earlier, most schools or all schools have a current vaccination policy. So I would just make sure you're reviewing that and that this new policy that you may or may not implement would be consistent with the vaccination policy you already have in place. Finally, we've got this idea of responses from various constituencies. And I don't want to rush through this. I know we're close to the top of the hour, but really quickly, I will just highlight here, many government and academic agencies have encouraged thoughtful vaccination policies. Your accreditor might have, or another organization that your school is affiliated with may have as well. Here I have a quote from the Illinois Board of Higher Education, Illinois Community College Board. They say, vaccination is the leading prevention strategy against COVID-19, and all public and private universities are strongly encouraged to require vaccination with appropriate exemptions to protect campus populations and slow transmission in surrounding communities. So it's just, I just wanted to reiterate that. Just stay on top of organizations that your school holds approval from or is affiliated with, and if they have issued any public guidance on this notion. Then, of course, I did mention as well the Indiana University lawsuit, and this lawsuit, eight students brought the suit in the Northern District of Indiana on a due process claim. The judge upheld IU's vaccine policy and denied the motion for a preliminary injunction. He said he found that there is no fundamental right to a collegiate education, nor is there a fundamental constitutional right to not wear a mask or to not be tested for a virus before entering a place of public accommodation. Rather, he found that these issues are transient and trivial inconveniences. And the court also noted that there are some unique circumstances when wearing a mask could negatively impact the student's educational experience, but considered those as matters for the university reasonably to address, not matters of constitutional import. And then just a few days ago, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that decision. And I have a quote here from that decision. Each university may decide what is necessary to keep other students safe in a congregate setting. Health exams and vaccinations against other diseases are common requirements of higher education. Vaccination protects not only the vaccinated persons, but also those who come in contact with them. And at a university, close contact is inevitable. So this is kind of the, I'd say, the main case right now, although there are, as Susan mentioned, several other cases pending brought by professors and students. And so obviously something to keep a lookout for but both of these decisions cited a Supreme Court case from way back when that upheld a requirement to get vaccines. And so the current legal thinking is that vaccine mandates are allowed with those exemptions we have discussed. And then, again, I know we're at 2 o'clock, so I will quickly go through these, but definitely something to contemplate as you're putting your policy together, or some of you may already be dealing with this, but just responses from students and employees. I have here a picture of a student at a Rutgers rally. Some students got together and said that they did not want a mandatory vaccine at Rutgers. Our clients have received a lot of pushback. They get emails from students and employees. They've received several formal letters requesting, it's a form letter actually that they've received several different times that students and employees want answers to a list of questions related to the vaccine mandate. We've seen students gather together and write petitions that have hundreds or thousands of signatures against the vaccine policy. And then, of course, you also have to deal with the publicity, PR, what the news is saying, and at this point, what people are saying about the school or the policy on Twitter as well. So, of course, as discussed, you just have to have a system in place for responding to all those, and I do encourage you to have a consistent response to all of those inquiries. And again, planned communications across verticals at the university. So if someone's reaching out to a different office or a different level within your system or your school, just need to kind of have a very consistent planned response to that. So we don't need to talk about these now. We've got PC resources here. Feel free to check out our blog with lots of updates about current legal issues. We've got webinars on demand, as Susan mentioned. You can always check out these webinars at a later date. My colleagues, Erin Lacey and Scott Goldschmidt, put together this incredible Title IX training series for any institutions who might need help in that area. So I encourage you to check out, I mean, what else would you possibly want to watch on YouTube besides a Title IX training series? So it's really very well done and very chock full of great knowledge. So I encourage you to check that out if that would be applicable for you. Here are some Title IX compliance materials as well that are available on our site, and a borrower defense to repayment reporting guide, very helpful for schools who need to deal with that as well, and our typical disclaimer, the purposes of this presentation, not legal advice, but we welcome you to reach out with any other questions or issues. And I did see a note at one point from a listener who said that the links weren't working in the presentation. I apologize for that. We will do our best to fix that before the presentation is uploaded to the website. Susan, do we have any other questions or anything else we need to address before we wrap this up?
I don't believe so, but I would like to thank you for participating in our webinar. We'd ask that you please complete and submit the survey that we'll display at the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you, and good luck navigating this evolving landscape. We will be here to help you at every turn.